In and up to 1967, there was no equal pay for women, no community childcare centres, no women's refuges, no neighbourhood centres, no equal pay for teachers. And to have an abortion, or to help women have an abortion, was a criminal offence. It really was a criminal offence, and women did go to jail. The no-fault divorce by mutual consent, was not achieved until January 1976. There was no contraceptive pill. Contraceptives, when available, were clumsy and often difficult for women to get hold of. It depended on where you lived, the chemist in the area, what his religion was, and the chemist was always a he, a male. When you had your periods or you needed contraceptives, you waited in the chemist shop till the chemist shop was empty, and the chemist gave you your Modest pads or whatever in a brown paper bag. Women were not allowed to drink in a hotel, even when accompanied by husband, boyfriend or family members. Women had to go to the ladies' lounge, which might be a separate room or just a veranda at the back of the hotel, and drinks for women in the ladies' lounge were dearer than the same drinks served to men in the bar. It was exceptional for women to have a career. It was expected that girls would go to school, go to work, get married, have children, look after husband and home. That was our God-given role. If you were not married by your middle 20s, it was assumed that there was something wrong with you and that you just couldn't get a man. You were called a spinster and became an old maid. Both were very derogatory terms. Very few women were able to go to university, let alone become a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist or a mathematician. Even if they excelled enough to win a scholarship, they needed to be strong, determined and have good financial supportive family to succeed. But women could be and were encouraged to be nurses, an extension of women's role in the family. Nurses were needed to do the daily care and routine tasks of looking after patients, cleaning beds, wards, supporting and looking after the needs of doctors. And looking after the needs of doctors was a very, very important part of nurses' job in those days. Since 1950, the Union of Australian Women had been actively lobbying to advance the status of women as citizens and workers and mothers and the well-being of families and children in a world free of war. They supported the newly emerging women's liberation movement and the women's electoral lobby in the late 60s and early 70s and joined their campaigns. In October 79, Zelda D'Aprano chained herself to the doors of the Commonwealth Centre and then with two other women chained themselves to the door of the Arbitration Court, where the case for equal pay was being heard. In 1972, the equal pay case was again heard, and after intensive lobbying by the Women's Liberation, UAW and some unions, women were granted equal pay for equal work of equal value to be phased in over a period of 2 years. A major struggle in the early 70s was for women's right to control her body. The first pro-abortion demonstration in Australia was organised by the Women's Liberation Movement, Union of Australian Women, Abortion Law Reform Association and the YWCA. It was a massive demonstration and march in Russell Street. Some women confronted the police and tried to hand them sworn declarations that they'd had illegal abortions and demanded that the police arrest them. The police were overwhelmed and couldn't deal with them and tried to push them away. In 1971, Zelda D'Aprano, Bon Hull, Elva Geekie and Thelma Solomon boarded 2 city trams and refused to pay more than 80% of the fare because they said they only received 80% of women's wages. That was a great fun campaign. On the 29th of September 1972, a group of women tried to buy a drink in the bar of Young and Jackson's Hotel on the corner of Swanson Street and Flinders Street, and they were forcibly removed by the police. Again in 1973, a group of women invaded the bar of the Exchange Hotel in Cheltenham and asked for a beer and refused to move to the ladies' lounge. After about 15 minutes, the manager gave up and we were served beer at the bar. It was a great day. We had a lot of fun. In 1970, women demonstrated against Miss Victoria contest and contests which sexualised young women. In the women's movement and consciousness raising groups, women were able to talk about themselves, their lives and their sexuality. In 1973, the first national gathering of lesbian women, the Radical Lesbian Conference, was held, and later that year, Melbourne's first public women's dance was held. It was unusual, it was great. In 72-73, the women's theatre was taking off, and Women's Theatre Group was formed, and they performed regularly to enthusiastic packed houses. Out of these experiences, the Women's Circus was born. As a result of funding from the Whitlam government in 1977, neighbourhood houses and women's learning centres were opened, providing programs for women wanting to return to work or further education. They were the forerunner of today's neighbourhood centres. The first to open was Diamond Valley, which originally was a women's learning centre. Programs were designed to meet the needs of women. Tutors for women, and the hours were from 9:30 or 10 p.m. to 3 p.m, so that women could attend during their children's school hours, and childcare was provided. Of the 6 original women's learning centres, only the Thornbury Women's Neighbourhood Centre is still around. The first women's refuge opened in Kew in 1970s. For the first time, women needing to escape violent domestic situations had somewhere to go. Its address was secret, and a voluntary roster of women looked after the house, the women and the children. Women's Liberation ran their own women's switchboard and were able to help and advise women who rang in. Getting a divorce was very difficult for women unless you could prove adultery. This was easily done if both parties colluded. Otherwise, you had to be separated for at least 5 years. In 1977, no-fault divorce was finally mandated. One or either party can now apply for a divorce after a separation of 12 months and 1 day. The first organisation to concern itself with the needs of migrant working women in 1977 was WITCH, Women in Industry and Community Health, was formed, and women volunteers were trained to take contraceptives and health information in the languages of migrant women to working women in selected factories. There was no community childcare. The centres that were opened during the war so women could work in munitions factories were closed when men came back home and women went back into the home. Women had always worked, usually doing house cleaning, waitressing, machining at home, or any job that can be done or could be done during school hours. We campaigned hard. It wasn't easy, but we had a lot of fun along the way. We even had a women's only concert in 1973 in the Melbourne Town Hall. Imagine a concert for women run by women in the Melbourne Town Hall. The power of sisterhood carried us along and made the struggle so worthwhile. I wouldn't have missed it for quits. But finally, on a serious note, It's painful to us to watch the gains we fought for being eroded. You young women must get together with other women and fight to keep what you have and fight to get whatever it is else that you need. It's your struggle. We still have no gender equity. And on that, you know, in November, female barristers are now pushing for equal pay. Even they, as barristers and silks, don't get the same opportunities or equal pay with their male counterparts.